The morning mist clung to the edges of the POW camp like a soft, ghostly veil, wrapping around the wooden barracks and the makeshift paths that led to the newly built bathhouse, a structure that, to the Japanese prisoners, seemed impossibly strange in its pristine simplicity. Its gleaming metal pipes, the neatly tiled floors, the warm steam curling through the air like ethereal smoke from some kind of magic. When the first group of prisoners was told to enter, they shuffled hesitantly, their bare feet making uncertain taps against the polished concrete, their hands gripping each other or the sides of the doorframe as though touching the bathhouse itself might reveal some hidden trap, some cruel deception, for they had been conditioned to believe that captivity was a series of relentless hardships, that showers were cold buckets dumped unceremoniously on heads, that sanitation was a concept applied only to the enemy, not to prisoners, yet here, the scent of clean soap, warm water, and the subtle hint of disinfectant filled their senses in a way that was at once comforting and disorienting, creating a tension in the air that was almost palpable, a nervous excitement, a quiet suspense that made each man's heart race as they inched forward, their eyes darting from the metal shower heads hanging like strange instruments above them to the steam rising in gentle curls. Shimmering in the morning light, their minds racing with memories of forced marches, of filthy uniforms crusted with mud and blood, of lice-infested blankets and the constant, gnawing hunger that had defined their lives for months, perhaps years, until this moment, when the impossible reality of cleanliness and warmth confronted them with the revelation that the world they had known, the world of war, deprivation and brutality, was not the only one, that in this place, in this camp, humanity and decency could exist even for those labeled the enemy. And as the first droplets of water cascaded down onto their shoulders, sliding along their backs and washing away sweat, grime, and the residue of fear, they gasped involuntarily, the warmth igniting a mixture of relief and disbelief in their chests, their bodies shivering not from cold, but from the shock of sensation, from the unfamiliar pleasure of cleanliness, and the realization that such a simple act, the washing of the body, could be so profound, so transformative, so unexpectedly powerful. And as the prisoners moved through the bathhouse, their movements awkward, hesitant, almost ceremonious, following the rhythm of flowing water, of running faucets, of steam swirling around them in the quiet symmetry of the American camp's design, they began to exchange glances, small, incredulous smiles breaking across faces that had been hardened by months of deprivation and fear, their eyes reflecting not mockery but an almost childlike wonder at the mechanical ingenuity, the thoughtfulness that had gone into the structure, and the subtle, unspoken lesson it carried, that the Americans, who had been their foes in battle, were capable of compassion, of order, of planning for human dignity even amid the chaos of war. And in that realization, the prisoners felt an internal, almost imperceptible shift, a cognitive dissonance that made them question everything they had been taught about their enemies, about themselves, about the world they believed was cruel and merciless. And while the warm water continued to pour, cascading over shoulders, necks, and backs, catching the light in tiny rainbows in the steam, a quiet tension settled over the bathhouse, a suspended breath, as if the very walls held their collective astonishment, their awe, their fear that such comfort could exist for those who were supposed to be punished. And in that suspended moment, the POWs became acutely aware of the broader implications, that cleanliness was not merely hygiene, but a psychological weapon, a tool of restoration, a subtle means of breaking down resentment and fostering understanding. And as they rinsed away the grime, they began to recognize the stark contrast between the world of deprivation they had endured and the possibilities of a life where human dignity was preserved, where even in captivity they were treated as men, not simply as enemy soldiers, and the warmth of the showers seeped deeper than skin, into the soul, provoking memories of home, of family, of rivers and mountains washed clean in sunlight, of mornings when soap and water were available freely, before the world had erupted into fire and chaos. And for the first time in months, perhaps years, the prisoners felt something resembling hope, something that transcended the immediate reality of their imprisonment, a realization that even amid war, life could still offer small, tangible pleasures, and that even their enemies could display generosity, skill and foresight, and as the water ran, mingling with steam and the scent of soap, the prisoners lingered, some leaning under the spray longer than necessary, some pausing to watch their fellow soldiers, all of them sharing this moment of revelation in silence. And outside, the camp buzzed with quiet activity. Guards observing respectfully, engineers and medics noting details, the mechanics of supply and maintenance functioning smoothly. And in the midst of this orchestrated normalcy, the Japanese POWs began to see, perhaps for the first time, the full spectrum of humanity in the people they had been taught to hate, the full implication of care and planning, and the silent, almost imperceptible power of what they were experiencing. A simple shower transformed into a lesson, into an instrument of psychological insight, into a profound confrontation with the unexpected civility of the enemy. And as the first minute passed, the prisoners emerged from the showers slowly, droplets clinging to hair and skin, their eyes wide with astonishment, their breaths steadying, and the suspense lingered. What would come next? How would their perceptions shift further as they were allowed to experience more of this strange, unfamiliar world, a world where dignity, hygiene, and order existed even for captives, and where the boundaries of expectation and disbelief collided, creating a tension so potent that even the air itself seemed thick with anticipation. And as the final droplets slid from their shoulders and legs, the prisoners realized that this was more than cleanliness. It was revelation. It was shock. It was the opening chapter in a story of human empathy, of the war's complexities made tangible, of a moment that would linger in memory far longer than any battle, far longer than any suffering endured. A moment in which the simple act of showering became an event of almost cinematic proportion, setting the stage for further discoveries, and for the unfolding understanding that in America, the machinery of war could coexist with the machinery of care, that enemies could be treated as men, that hygiene itself could become a mirror reflecting the absurdity, tragedy, and unexpected mercy of human conflict. And as they dried, wrapped in towels, the prisoners exchanged silent nods, subtle acknowledgments that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that transcended nationalities and armies, a moment suspended in time, a microcosm of civilization amid the brutality of war, and the suspense of what lay ahead. More knowledge, more experiences, more revelations about the world they had not imagined, hung palpably in the warm, scented air, a tension that promised both reflection and transformation. And as the minutes passed, the Japanese POWs began to understand this was the first step in seeing the war, their enemies, and even themselves, in a completely new light. And the first minute of revelation closed with silent awe, anticipation, and a subtle, overwhelming sense that nothing in their lives, no hardship, no battle, no deprivation, could have prepared them for the shocking, almost cinematic experience of something as deceptively simple as a modern shower, a moment that would ripple through memory for the rest of their lives. As the Japanese POWs stepped back from the showers, droplets glistening on their skin like tiny prisms catching the early light, they were guided down the polished walkways toward the mess hall, another place that defied every expectation they had held about captivity, a building filled with warmth, the smell of fresh bread, the soft clatter of cutlery, the low hum of conversation, and rows of neatly arranged tables where food awaited, food that was not merely sustenance, but a revelation in itself, colorful vegetables steamed to perfection, meat cooked tenderly, grains and fruits presented with care, and all portions measured not in punishment, but in thoughtful adequacy. And as they approached, the prisoners hesitated, hands trembling, eyes wide, glancing at the American guards who watched with calm patience, not suspicion or hostility, noting with fascination how the prisoners' expressions oscillated between disbelief, cautious hope, and the faintest trace of a smile. The cultural shock so profound it rendered them momentarily silent, and as the first trays were handed out, the prisoners took them with the slowest of motions, almost as if touching the food might break some spell, and the first bites were tentative, eyes widening again at the unfamiliar textures, flavors, and warmth, the softness of bread, the richness of meat, the subtle seasoning that spoke of kitchens accustomed to care rather than expediency. and each chew became a small meditation, a recognition of the vast difference between what they had endured in previous months or years and the civilized, almost indulgent treatment they now received. And as they ate, their eyes wandered over the mess hall, walls painted in calm, neutral tones, windows letting in sunlight that danced on the polished floors, overhead fans turning lazily, the soft murmur of other prisoners echoing with laughter at a private joke, a sound so alien that some of the men froze, unsure whether they were hearing reality or some mirage born from long deprivation. Yet the warmth of camaraderie, even among men separated by language and ideology, began to permeate the air, and slowly, cautiously, small exchanges began, nods, gestures, hesitant words, smiles breaking across faces long taught to be rigid, and with each exchange, the POWs' minds processed the implications that here, in this camp, human dignity was not a reward but a baseline, a principle applied regardless of prior allegiance, and that the Americans, who had been their sworn enemies in battle, were now demonstrating an unshakable adherence to fairness, routine, and respect for life, and the psychological impact was staggering. The prisoners' minds, long trained for survival under deprivation and humiliation, now struggled to reconcile shock with relief, fear with curiosity, suspicion with acceptance, and as the meal progressed, they noticed further details that compounded their amazement. The efficiency of the kitchen, the careful cleaning of surfaces, the systematic disposal of waste, the warmth of hot tea served in ceramic mugs rather than tin cups, the crispness of napkins folded neatly beside plates, the orderliness of queues, all seemingly trivial yet magnified by contrast with the chaos and squalor of war and imprisonment. And as the first hour passed, subtle patterns emerged. The Americans were not performing acts of charity, but had constructed a self-sustaining, humane environment in which prisoners could survive, perhaps even thrive if they followed the rules, and the depth of foresight required was almost incomprehensible. The water systems and showers were not randomly placed. The mess hall was positioned for optimal airflow and sunlight. Sanitation was enforced with precision. Medical staff monitored even minor ailments. Schedules were adhered to like clockwork, and through all of this, the POWs began to experience a new concept, that survival need not come at the cost of dignity. That structure, hygiene, and provision could exist hand in hand, a revelation that shook them more profoundly than any battlefield encounter, more than any gunfire, more than any forced march, because it struck at the very foundation of their wartime conditioning. The assumptions drilled into them that life was meant to be harsh, that enemies were to be feared and hated, that every moment should be endured rather than appreciated, and as the day wore on, they were introduced to additional layers of this startlingly humane system, bedding that was clean and inspected daily, the meticulous folding of uniforms, the inspection of personal belongings for order and care rather than punishment, and the unexpected generosity of personal space, privacy, and rest, all designed to maintain both physical and mental health, to prevent disease, to foster compliance without cruelty, to create the most efficient, humane environment possible. And each lesson was absorbed slowly, consciously, sometimes with disbelief that such attentiveness could exist for men who had once been deemed the enemy. And in quiet moments, when the prisoners wandered the campgrounds, brushing past neat hedges, observing gardens tended for both food and morale, seeing sports fields where men exercised under the sun, hearing laughter that was genuine and uncoerced, they realized that the war they had fought had never imagined such treatment, that their own experiences had been shaped by deprivation and cruelty, and that this simple yet profound orchestration of daily life was a new kind of warfare, one fought with civility, order, and foresight, proving that human ingenuity was not only for destruction, but for restoration, for teaching, for shaping minds even amidst the echoes of violence and conflict. And as the evening approached, the POWs lined up once more for another shower, their movements less hesitant, more curious, their hands moving under the streams of warm water not with fear, but with quiet awe, their thoughts churning with the realization that the Americans' care was not limited, that the sophistication of the camp's design extended to every detail, and that each act of hygiene, each meal, Each orderly routine was a thread in a larger tapestry of human ingenuity and moral choice, a lesson in how even the smallest comforts could be wielded to shift perspectives, to challenge assumptions, and to awaken understanding. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, twinkling above a camp that had once been a cage, the prisoners emerged from the showers glistening, hearts and minds stirred, their breaths deep and even, the suspense lingering, the anticipation of what tomorrow would reveal pressing gently on their consciousness, the subtle thrill of discovery mingling with the remnants of fear, the knowledge that this was only the beginning of an astonishing, transformative experience, and that each moment of daily life here, simple, methodical, humane, would continue to shock, educate, and redefine everything they had believed about their captors, about war, and about themselves. The first hour of revelation drawing to a close with a quiet, almost cinematic resonance that promised deeper understanding, further astonishment, and the unfolding of a story far more complex and humane than anything they could have imagined, leaving the prisoners suspended on the precipice of insight, poised to witness the next layers of this extraordinary, almost surreal reality. As night fell over the POW camp, a soft, almost imperceptible wind rustled through the rows of tents and Quonset huts, carrying with it the sense of freshly baked bread, warm soap, and damp earth, smells so foreign and arresting that the prisoners paused in their nightly routines, inhaling deeply, almost afraid that the world had shifted beneath their feet, that somehow this serene, ordered environment was a mirage conjured from exhaustion and disbelief. Yet nothing dissipated. The lights from the showers and mess halls glowed warmly against the darkened sky, reflecting off puddles from the afternoon cleaning, shimmering like scattered jewels, and the prisoners, some still wet from the evening rinse, walked carefully along the gravel paths, their bare feet crunching softly, eyes wide with the mixture of wonder and suspicion, as if every perfectly aligned tent, every trimmed hedge, every orderly line of wash basins was a test, a puzzle to decode, a proof that the Americans' intentions were either profoundly benevolent or dangerously meticulous. And in that tension, each man's mind raced through memories of marches, of hunger, of disease, of endless fear and the cruelty of both nature and man, all contrasted sharply against the warmth of hot water, the feel of clean clothing on sun-scorched skin, the soft mattresses beneath them, and the knowledge that here, for the first time in months, maybe years, survival was paired with dignity, with respect, with intentional care, and as the night deepened, the guards patrolled silently, their footsteps soft, their presence firm but unobtrusive, allowing the POWs a rare sense of autonomy and trust, something almost revolutionary in its subtlety, and whispers began to circulate among the men, soft murmurs in Japanese that carried the weight of awe, disbelief, and the tentative stirrings of hope, discussing how beds were sanitized, how latrines were cleaned methodically, how food was portioned not arbitrarily but thoughtfully, how every routine reinforced not only hygiene but a sense of worth, and some even laughed quietly, almost nervously, as the absurdity of their own astonishment dawned upon them, that such small everyday elements, showers, soap, warm meals, could carry the power to dismantle assumptions, to reshape beliefs, to instill a sense of normalcy in men who had been deprived of it for years. And while the camp fell silent, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant hum of generators, the prisoners' minds churned with the cognitive dissonance of gratitude and fear, of disbelief and recognition, pondering how an enemy could provide such care without expectation of immediate return, how the structure, precision, and foresight of every element, water pressure, towel availability, soap placement, clean linens, ventilation, waste disposal, meal presentation, scheduling, were not random acts, but a carefully orchestrated system designed to maintain not only physical health but mental equilibrium. And as the first few stars emerged, trembling in the cold night sky, some prisoners lifted their heads, gazing upwards, the cool air brushing against faces still damp from the evening ritual, and for a moment, a rare and fragile serenity enveloped them, a pause in the relentless flow of wartime hardship, and in that serenity, realization took root. The Americans' ingenuity was not just in weapons, logistics, or strategy, but in the subtler, Profound orchestration of care, civility, and human dignity. A revelation that was simultaneously liberating and disorienting, that challenged the very core of every assumption they had carried from the front lines, the jungle and the prisons, and as they returned to their huts to rest, curling beneath warm, clean blankets. Minds still buzzing with astonishment and cautious understanding, the night seemed to stretch longer, holding them suspended between fear and wonder, exhaustion and enlightenment. And the final seconds before sleep fell carried a suspenseful, almost cinematic weight, that the lessons of hygiene, structure, and humane treatment they had witnessed in this single day were only the beginning, that tomorrow and every day after would layer revelation upon revelation, unraveling their previous understanding of war, captivity, and the humanity that could persist even amidst the machinery of conflict, leaving the prisoners poised on the precipice of transformation, minds and hearts opened, waiting for the next extraordinary insight into a world that they had never imagined could exist within the boundaries of a POW camp. And as the wind whispered softly through the camp, rustling tents and trees, the unspoken suspense lingered. What more would they discover? What deeper truths about humanity would they encounter? And how would this new understanding alter not only their perception of their captors, but of themselves? The answers held tantalizingly just out of reach, like the first glimmers of dawn over the horizon, promising revelation, shock, and profound engagement in the days to come. As dawn broke over the camp, a pale, almost ethereal light spilled across the neatly lined tents and Quonset huts, glinting off the dew-soaked gravel paths like a scattering of tiny stars, and the German POWs awoke to a world that seemed impossibly ordered, impossibly calm, their senses still reeling from the revelations of the previous night, the comfort, the showers, the care, all of it lingering like a vivid dream they feared would dissolve the moment they moved, yet nothing faded. They were thrust immediately into the rhythm of another day, one orchestrated with meticulous precision, beginning with the clang of the morning bell, signaling a lineup that was orderly, almost ceremonial, where every man's place was marked, every motion anticipated, and the officers watched with a mix of discipline and restraint, ensuring that the prisoners moved as one without coercion. The POW's eyes scanning the faces of Americans who did not glare, who did not bark commands, who did not wield fear as authority, but instead guided them with firm hands and clear instructions, gestures precise, voices calm yet authoritative. And the contrast to their previous experiences was so sharp it nearly unhinged their assumptions, that human beings could be treated with such organization and care without cruelty, without arbitrary punishment, without the constant presence of terror. And as the men marched past the mess hall to receive their breakfast, the aromas of fresh bread, warm eggs, and brewed coffee wafted through the crisp morning air, unfamiliar yet inviting, and for the first time in months, they understood that sustenance could be both abundant and systematically rationed, that nutrition and care were not mutually exclusive, and as they queued, their hands trembling slightly from both cold and disbelief, they noticed the trays, the utensils, the cleanliness of the hall, the absence of vermin, the presence of polished surfaces, and the orderly arrangement of food, each portion measured, balanced, and nourishing. And the POWs whispered among themselves, their voices low, filled with awe and quiet amusement, as if discussing a surreal vision, noting how their meals were not only edible but pleasant, that hygiene extended even to cutlery and plates, that sanitation could be maintained rigorously without complaint or punishment. And in the back of their minds, a seed of suspicion grew alongside gratitude. Why was it so? Why had they never encountered this level of care in captivity before? Was it strategy, benevolence, propaganda, or an entirely new philosophy of war and human management? And as the men sat on benches eating in silence, some dared to taste the freshly baked bread, noting the softness, the warmth, and how it contrasted with the hard, stale rations they had endured for months, the smell of coffee seeping into their nostrils and warming their chests. And for a fleeting moment, the weight of fear, hunger, and exhaustion seemed to lift, replaced by a tentative understanding that in this strange, foreign land, the war they had imagined as total cruelty was, paradoxically punctuated with humanity, a humanity they were neither accustomed to nor prepared for. And as they finished breakfast, the POWs were directed to participate in a structured morning routine, stretching exercises, light labor, maintenance of personal quarters, and inspection of uniforms. Each activity designed not as punishment but as engagement, instilling a sense of purpose, routine, and order. And as the day progressed, they discovered even more: latrines cleaned systematically, wash stations stocked with soap and towels, water flowing freely and safely, every small detail reinforcing the broader principle that organization, foresight, and care could coexist with security and discipline, and that these elements were deliberately engineered to preserve health, morale, and, unexpectedly, trust, the POW's astonishment growing with each observation, as they began to understand that survival under these conditions was not merely a matter of endurance, but of interaction with systems designed to maintain dignity and human decency. And as afternoon arrived, bringing with it sunlight warming the camp, a few brave prisoners ventured into recreational areas, reading corners, shaded benches, areas for games and conversation, spaces created not to entertain frivolously but to stimulate mind and body, to combat the ennui and mental degradation that had plagued them in previous captivity. And as they engaged tentatively, sharing words in broken English, gestures, and smiles, a slow transformation began. A dawning realization that this treatment was intentional, systemic, a philosophy of care embedded in every structure, every schedule, every officer's action. And while part of them still clung to disbelief, suspicion, and fear, another part, quieter but insistent, began to absorb, to learn, to adapt, and in the quiet moments of reflection, perhaps during a pause between tasks or while gazing at the clean, orderly lines of tents, the prisoners considered a notion almost inconceivable to them: that an enemy could exhibit such humanity without subterfuge, without immediate advantage, simply because it was possible, because it was right, because the application of structure, hygiene, and organized care could coexist with war and authority. And as dusk approached, the shadows lengthened across the camp. The POWs lined up for the evening head count, a ritual both familiar and newly infused with meaning, each man silently processing the stark juxtaposition of their expectations and reality, the psychological tension thick in the cooling air, the weight of astonishment and quiet respect pressing upon them. And as the first stars emerged, glimmering faintly against the darkening sky, a silent suspense lingered. What further lessons awaited in the coming days? What additional insights into human nature and the philosophy of structured care would challenge, shock, and enlighten them, leaving every prisoner poised at the edge of comprehension, their minds alive with questions, their hearts open to revelation, yet unsure of what truth the next sunrise would deliver in the meticulously designed world they now inhabited. As the final weeks of their stay unfolded, the Japanese POWs moved through the camp with a mixture of routine familiarity and constant astonishment, the once incomprehensible structures of order and care now embedded into their daily consciousness, yet still sparking disbelief at every corner. Morning dawned bright and humid, the sun glinting off the wet surfaces of polished walkways, clean shower stalls, and neatly arranged bedding. And as the prisoners lined up for the day's briefing, the air itself seemed alive with the scent of soap, fresh water, and the faint tang of metal from the camp's meticulous infrastructure, a sensory reminder that hygiene was not incidental, but an omnipresent force shaping every experience, every movement, every expectation. And as they listened to the guards and officers deliver instructions with calm authority, the POWs could not help but notice the absence of threats, the absence of shouting, the absence of arbitrary punishment, replaced instead by encouragement, routine, and a subtle, almost imperceptible system of accountability that relied on participation, discipline, and internalized order rather than fear. And as the men moved through the day and performing maintenance on living quarters, inspecting communal areas, participating in light educational exercises, or simply observing the quiet hum of life around them, each POW became increasingly aware of the staggering contrast between this environment and the chaos, filth, and brutality they had endured elsewhere. The sense of disbelief compounded as they discovered the showers themselves, Long rows of stalls with hot water flowing endlessly. Soap provided freely, towels stacked neatly, drains unclogged, and ventilation ensuring that no steam or humidity lingered beyond comfort. And as they tentatively entered, the first hesitant touches of warm water cascading over skin produced expressions of pure astonishment, smiles trembling on lips previously hardened by war, whispers of disbelief passing from one prisoner to another as they dared to enjoy the sensation of cleanliness without fear of reprisal or neglect. And as they stepped out, towels drying skin made soft again, hair combed and washed, uniforms fresh and odorless. A new understanding began to crystallize. Hygiene was not just about comfort, but about empowerment, dignity, and preservation of both body and mind, a concept so alien to them that it seemed almost magical, almost revolutionary. And yet, as the sun climbed higher, revealing the full expanse of the camp, its carefully spaced Quonset huts, the orderly pathways, the recreational areas for reading, games, and conversation, the vegetable gardens, medical stations, and classrooms, the POWs recognized an underlying philosophy, one that went far beyond mere survival, that human beings could be treated as ends in themselves. That structure, order, and care could coexist with security and authority, and that trust, when earned and respected, could reshape the entire environment, even in the midst of war. And as the day waned, with shadows stretching long across clean gravel and polished surfaces, the POWs paused in quiet reflection, gazing toward the horizon where the sun set behind distant trees and mountains, feeling a strange weight lift from their chests, a mix of awe, respect, and lingering uncertainty, for they knew that what they had witnessed, the intersection of human decency, scientific planning, and meticulous order, was unprecedented in their experience of war. And as the final head count was called, the prisoners lined up in silence, the last rays of light glinting off their uniforms, their faces marked by astonishment, contemplation, and the subtle realization that they had seen a society capable of combining discipline with compassion. And in that quiet, suspended moment, the suspense lingered like a held breath. What truths would remain with them once they returned to the wider world? How would these lessons of hygiene, care, and structured human management echo through their memories? And could they ever reconcile the enormity of this revelation with everything they had known before, leaving every man on the edge of comprehension, the final curtain drawn, yet questions and awe lingering in the cool evening air like an invisible, indelible imprint of humanity at its most disciplined, most thoughtful, and most astonishing?